Welcome to the Synthesis of Yoga, the book that changed my life. For those who are new, we are studying Aurobindo's The Synthesis of Yoga, the book that synthesized the entire wisdom tradition of India, the yogic wisdom tradition of India, and gave us the integral yoga, a yoga that embraces life and a yoga that is evolutionary, not a yoga that is rejecting and renouncing life. And in this book, we have reached part 1, chapter 7, the standards of conduct and spiritual freedom. We are reading line by line to dive into Sri Aurobindo's yogic consciousness and imbibe its qualities into us. Very act of reading is sadhana. This had been one of my most powerful transformative practices, reading Sri Aurobindo. Even while now, when I am reading repeatedly again and again, same book, I see how much it is growing within me, changing me within. So, very act of reading is sadhana, and we have the link in the description where you can follow the text. In our last episode, which was 93, Sri Aurobindo gave us insights into two master impulses within the individual. One is the individualistic tendency to fulfill one's needs, desires, and preferences. Other is the communal tendency to belong to a collectivity and identify with a collectivity and work for the collectivity. These are the two master impulses. They often come in confrontation, conflict, and that's the matrix from where he refers to that as an obscure matrix, from where the entire human history of collective life, its culture, its civilizational development, all that has emerged in this interface of the tension between the individualism and collectivism. These two forces always confront each other, waiting to be resolved, harmonized. Now we are moving into today's episode 94. We are starting with paragraph 14. In the conflict of the claims of society with the claims of the individual, two ideal and absolute solutions confront each other. So in that interface between these two conflicts, there are two solutions. They're not just solutions, they're absolute solutions that come in confrontation. Let's figure out what these absolute solutions are. There is the demand of the group that the individual should subordinate himself more or less completely or even lose his independent existence in the community. The smaller must be immolated or self-offered to the larger unit. This is the demand, an absolute demand from the collectivity, the community, that says you as an individual must subordinate. Forget about your individuality. Serve the collectivity. Immolate yourself at the service of the collective. That is the demand that is put on the individual as an absolute requirement. There is the demand of the group that the individual should subordinate himself more or less completely. Not partial, complete subordination, or even lose his independent existence in the community, or must be immolated or self-offered to the larger unit. And this conflict between the smaller and the larger, because the larger unit is a composition of smaller units. So the individual is the smaller unit here, which is expected to subordinate and lose itself in the larger collective identity, its needs, its preferences. He must accept the need of the society as his own need, the desire of the society as his own desire. He must live not for himself, but for the tribe, clan, commune, or nation, of which he is a member. Tribe, clan, commune, or nation. These are larger and larger scales of collective self-organization, collective entities. Nations are the largest units that emerged in the last 200 to 300 years, self-conscious collectivity that can govern larger entities with a common code of conduct. And nations and its governments creates codes of conduct and expect the individuals to serve the collective at all the levels, tribe, clan, commune, or nation. Even at a smaller scale of family where we can see it much more vividly and clearly, individual is expected to serve the family. And most people do gladly, taking care of their family, children, parents, all that, where you deprioritize your individual needs, preferences. Instead, you look at the larger entity as your identity and you serve the needs of the larger entity. Now, extend it to include the tribe, the clan, the commune, the nation. That's how our sense of identification expands to serve the collectivity. And it comes naturally and spontaneously to individuals who experience that sense of identification, that I am not a small individual, I am this larger collectivity. Therefore, the leaders are born through that collective identification. And in the last century, when India was struggling for independence, so many individuals gave their lives for the freedom of India. Such self-giving is what builds a collectivity. So that's one of the absolute laws, absolute solutions when this confrontation happens between individual liberty and the collectivity. So collectivity expects the individuals to serve the collectivity, identify with it, see its desires, needs, and preferences as the needs, desires, and the preferences of the individual. So individual spontaneously serving the collectivity. So he must accept the need of the society as his own need, the desire of the society as his own desire. He must live not for himself, but for the tribe, clan, commune, or nation, of which he is a member. The ideal and absolute solution from the individual standpoint would be a society that exists not for itself, for its own overriding collective purpose, but for the good of the individual and his fulfillment, for the greater and more perfect life of its members. Now, seeing it from the other side, what is the absolute solution? That is to see the collectivity and its purpose is to fulfill the individual and the needs of the individual, fulfillment of the individual. This again rarely happens. But that is what is required. The ideal and absolute solution from the individual's point of view. And individuals do have this expectation that the collective takes care of me. The family takes care of me. The tribe stands for me. The community stands up for me. The nation protects me. Take care of my growth, my fullness, my fulfillment. That is the expectation of the individual from the collective. So the ideal and absolute solution from the individual standpoint would be a society that existed not for itself. While society can exist independent of the needs of the individual and collective purposes begin to override the individual needs fulfillment. When that purpose is disconnected from the individual's lives, that's where the tension sets in. Instead, the society that existed not for itself, for its all overriding collective purpose, but for the good of the individual and his fulfillment, for the greater and more perfect life of all its members. One of the chief functions the collectivity provides is the protection, preservation, self-defense. Individually you're weak, but collectively you become strong. So when, for example, a nation is formed, the nation can protect its individuals, but in order to protect, it has to have its collective laws, collective defense systems. But when that collective lawmaking system and defense system and protection system itself become an end in itself without looking at the fulfillment of the individual, then we miss the whole point of organizing ourselves into a larger collectivity. So the ideal and absolute solution from the individual standpoint would be a society that existed not for itself, for its all overriding collective purpose, but for the good of the individual and his fulfillment, for the greater and more perfect life of all its members. Not some of its members, but all its members. The tendency when power accumulates in smaller groups is that they serve themselves, fulfill their needs at the cost of the larger group. This is where the corruption, distortion happens. But an ideal society is that takes care of all its members, representing as far as possible his best self and helping him to realize it. Best self. Every individual has both light and shadow. So if the collectivity can enhance the light, the best self of the individual, that will be the ideal, helping him to realize it. It would respect the freedom of each of its members and maintain itself not by law and force, but by the free and spontaneous consent of its constituent persons. So an ideal collectivity will be such, it will not be imposing its laws, enforcing its laws. Instead, there will be a free and spontaneous consent of its constituent persons. If individuals can come together and arrive at a spontaneous consensus, not a consensus that is arrived at after debates and struggles and strife, but a spontaneous, self-organizing, harmonious consensus. Now, that's the kind of ideal dreamers dream of. Can a collectivity come together and spontaneously self-organize and arrive at a consensus of its own self-governance? So, in that, representing as far as possible his best self and helping him to realize it, it would respect the freedom of each of its members and maintain itself not by law and force. This is very important. Maintaining itself by law and force. Not by law and force, but by the free and spontaneous consent of its constituent persons. So these are the two absolute laws, solutions that the human heart aspiring for. One is to see that the individual serves the collective and its needs, identify with the larger collective. Other is the collectivity is fulfilling the individual needs, the best possibility of an individual, having absolute freedom. And in that space, the collectivity is coming together in a spontaneous consent. That will be an ideal solution coming from both sides. An ideal society of either kind does not exist anywhere and would be most difficult to create, more difficult still to keep in precarious existence, so long as individual man clings to his egoism as the primary motive of existence. So these two types, ideal society where individual gives himself entirely to serve the collectivity and collectivity focus itself entirely to fulfill the individual, this doesn't exist. And it cannot exist, it cannot come into existence or even sustain itself. It's a precarious existence as long as the egoism of the individual exists. Egoism and the ego is what gives the individual sense that I am separate from the collective, the rest of the life. Therefore, I want to prioritize my own fulfillment at the cost of the rest of the people, life around me. That egoism, when it dominates, as long as that exists and the individual cling to that egoism, it will be impossible for these ideal solutions to emerge. And that ego, as long as it is the primary motive engine for all actions, all decisions, that will not enable the emergence of this ideal solution where individual gives himself entirely to the collective and collectivity takes care of the individual's fulfillment. As long as individual egoism exists and motivation for action is born out of it, this will be an impossibility. A general but not complete domination of the society over the individual is the easier way, and it is the system that nature from the first instinctively adopts and keeps in equilibrium by rigorous law, compelling custom, and careful indoctrination of the still subservient and ill-developed intelligence of the human creature. So nature preferred the collectivity over the individual. That had been nature's approach. And this happened in the context of ill-developed intelligence of the individual creature. The human being emerging in nature, yet to develop the intelligence, its purity, its clarity, its larger encompassing understanding. If that is not there, then nature has only one tool, that is, use the collectivity to control the individual. And now that control can come through indoctrination, imposition of customs, so that the law of the pack is maintained over the individual. And we have seen it before. As long as the individual remains unrefined, crude in impulses, violent in nature, such an external law and its compulsion is necessary. And nature has instinctively followed that, adopted the imposition of the collective over the individual needs, preferences, desires. So a general but not complete domination of the society over the individual is the easiest way. And it was easiest, and nature. And it is the system that nature from the first instinctively adopts and keeps in equilibrium by rigorous law, compelling custom, and careful indoctrination. Because the members are to be taught this is what the ideal society is. You have to serve the society, you have to serve the family, you have to serve the larger good of the collectivity. And this is done through customs and careful indoctrination of the still subservient and ill-developed intelligence of the human creature. So that human creature is still subservient and intelligence is ill-developed. As long as that is there, then nature prefers the collectivity imposing its custom and indoctrination over the individual. That's how that process unfolds. Nature's preference over the collective to control the individual. This had been the way nature had been developing the society. In primitive societies, the individual life is submitted to the rigid and immobile communal custom and rule. This is the ancient and would-be eternal law of the human pack. Would-be eternal law. Because every society tends to make its rules like this is our great tradition. It should not be questioned. They would prefer it to be made eternal. Ancient and would-be eternal law of the human pack, collective law, that tries always to masquerade as the everlasting decree of the imperishable Esha Dharma Sanatana. So there is a true dharma eternal dharma. But that is the living truth of the soul. However, the society masquerade as that Esha Dharma Sanatana, the eternal law of Dharma. But it is not the real Dharma. It is a pretext, a pretension that is cast into the social laws, saying that this is our Dharma, we have to follow, this is the Dharma and custom of our community, of society, you must follow it, and indoctrinating everyone to follow that. But it is not truly the Dharma. It is only a masquerade, not the true Dharma, living Dharma that is born out of the soul. So before its emergence of that true Dharma, society creates rules, regulations, and proclaim it to be the eternal Dharma. So the primitive societies, in the primitive societies, the individual life is submitted to rigid and immobile communal custom and rule. Rigid. These customs and rules doesn't really change. And it is immobile, cast rigidly, unchanging. It's not evolutionary. And that makes societies fossilize, harden. This is the ancient and would-be eternal law of the human pack that tries always to masquerading as the everlasting decree of the imperishable Esha Dharma Sanatana. And they all use one or other sacred names of the great individuals who realize their inner spiritual core. And in the name of these great individuals, society tend to make rigid rules, regulations, and impose it through indoctrination, all in the name of Dharma, an eternal law. And the ideal is not dead in the human mind. The most recent trend of human progress is to establish an enlarged and sumptuous edition of this ancient turn of collective living towards the enslavement of the human spirit. So what is the recent trend Sri Aurobindo is referring to here? We tend to imagine that it is the old primitive societies or old religions that impose themselves upon the society. Yes, old primitive societies curtail the freedom of the individual. Religions impose their rules and eternal laws upon the individual through their indoctrinations. But how is what we refer to as modern science doing? That too has its orthodoxy of seeing the nature as machine and the mechanical processes as its evidence of reference for truth, and man himself as the machine, and only scientific truth as the only truth, everything else as vague superstitions, and denying every other expressions, and using its methodologies, imposing itself on the individuals, creating collective laws and regulations. This is just a new form that uses the modern framework, but the tendency is always to what Sri Aurobindo is saying, enslavement of the human spirit within the rigid caste rules. This is the law. This is the scientific law. You cannot fly, period. You need to have machines to fly. That's an absolute thing. Gravitational law says so. You cannot float in the air. This is fixed. Laws of nature are absolute, eternal, unchanging law. You cannot question it. So science comes up with its own laws by studying physics, chemistry, biology, all that, and define this is the final law that everybody must follow, and trying to create a society based on those understanding. The ideal is not dead in the human mind. The most recent trend of human progress is to establish an enlarged and sumptuous edition, something that sounds more and more rational, and a sumptuous edition of this ancient turn of collective living towards the enslavement of the human spirit. There is here a serious danger of the integral development of a greater truth upon earth and a greater life. So we see that those cultures that were more successful in harnessing the forces of nature and creating scientific body of knowledge, which started in Europe. What happened? Europe went around the world colonizing every other culture, saying that you are all uncivilized people and none of your culture and knowledge has any validity. What is really valid is so-called scientific truth. And we are the rich, we are the powerful, we are the civilized cultures. We are here to civilize you. And in that name, great deal of exploitation, enslavement of the human spirit, all the cultures. Now, in the modern 20th century, what was happening was, in the name of globalization, global civilization, what was getting dominated was worldviews of a particular cultural grouping dominating every other nation, every other civilization, every other cultural grouping, wiping out their cultural diversity, denying their native bodies of knowledge, denying their experience, and trying to fit everyone into one mold provided by science and technology and European and Western culture. And we see now in this 21st century, in the last 10 years, a massive revolt against it, and nations reasserting themselves, various cultures reasserting themselves, their individuality, their liberty, their freedom to self-govern, their sovereignty. All that right now we see in the melting pot. But behind it, the tendency of the human spirit to proclaim that the particular rules and regulations that I have understood and come up with, this is the absolute eternal law, and I am going to impose it on everyone else. And this has reached a peak where human being itself is seen as a machine, society itself as a machine, and every individual a data point that can be traced by technological means, and behavior can be designed, perceptions can be manufactured, and mass mobilizations can be done, and every individual is linked by machines. And now we are using mechanical artificial intelligence to govern increasingly the collective behavior. So there is here a serious danger to the integral development of a greater truth upon earth and a greater life. Integral development. If we look at the development over the last 200 to 300 years with Industrial Revolution, it was largely coming from a scientific understanding of the machinery of the nature and harnessing mechanical powers of nature, and consumerism as its way of propagating itself. So there was financial capitalism that emerged and industrial capitalism altogether, creating an education system that focuses primarily on the mental development, conceptual development, thinking development, and neglecting every other part of the human being and fitting the human being into the production system. So the purpose of education was to produce, mass produce, batch produce people who will fit into the industries and create products of consumption and generate more and more products of consumption. A large-scale mechanization of life, all through this whole mechanical view of life, which has an exaggerated importance given to power of thought and analysis, rational intelligence, the age of reason. And logic itself is a machine. And now it has culminated in the artificial intelligence, which is a machine, which is standardizing, propagating itself, everything. And we are facing that danger. Whereas an integral development would require the emotional being, the sensual being, the sensory development, and beyond all that, the spiritual dimension to grow. These were all neglected, rejected by the mechanistic view of reality. The entire research paradigm was based on mechanistic view of reality. So now these are cracking up largely, and new perspectives are emerging, and that's the chaotic phase that we are passing through. So there is here a serious danger to the integral development of a greater truth upon earth and a greater life. And that danger is when one system imposes itself upon the entire humanity. For the desire and free seeking of the individual, however egoistic, however false, or perverted they may be in their immediate form, contain in their obscure shell the seed of a development necessary for the whole. So even when the individual's seeking for freedom, fulfillment of his desires, even if it is perverted, distorted, limited, behind it there is a force, a seed. That seed contains something that is absolutely necessary for the whole. For the desires and free seeking of the individual, however egoistic, however false, or perverted they may be in their immediate form, contain in their obscure shell the seed of a development necessary to the whole. His searchings and stumblings have behind them a force that has to be kept and transmuted into the image of the divine ideal. So this individual who is seeking individual liberty, freedom, fulfillment is driven by a force that has to be kept but transmuted into the image of the divine ideal. There is a divine ideal behind this force that is propelling the individuals to seek liberty, freedom, even when the way it is sought is distorted, limited. So a force that has to be kept and transmuted into the image of the divine ideal. So let's read this line. It's very, very important for the desire and free seeking of the individual. However egoistic, however false or perverted they may be in their immediate form, contain in their obscure shell the seed of a development necessary to the whole. This searching and stumbling have behind them a force that has to be kept and transmuted into the image of the divine ideal. So when you're an individual within the family, within the workplace, within the society, if you are beginning to search for that greater liberty, greater freedom, and greater perfection that is driving you from within, that force within you, even if the outward expression of your search may be limited, bound by ego, however be the distortion, the force is to be preserved, but it has to be transmuted into the divine ideal. That is when it will be serving the good of the larger, whether it is your family, workplace, or the society. That force needs to be enlightened and trained, but must not be suppressed or harnessed exclusively to society's heavy cartwheel. Society is seen as a heavy cart and its wheels, yoking people to the wheels of, for example, the current economic engine that is running on an economic system. We are yoking people to serve the economic engine of the society. That is what education system does. It is not concerned about what the individual truly is, what the potential of the individual is, but training the individuals to yoke to the cartwheel. Instead, what we need to do is the force that is animating individual liberty of the individuals, that has to be enlightened and trained. but must not be suppressed or harnessed. Instead of suppressing that drive of the individual or harnessing the drive exclusively to society's heavy cartwheels. So these are the two options we have. One is to suppress the individual drive or harness the individual drive. But if it is harnessed exclusively and yoked to society's heavy cartwheels, then we lose the individual. Servitude happens. Individualism is as necessary to the final perfection as the power behind group spirit. The stifling of the individual may well be the stifling of the God in man. So the final perfection that we seek requires individualism. Individualism is as necessary to the final perfection as the power behind the group spirit. There is a power behind the group spirit. It's not enough that power behind group spirit is recognized. Individualism is required for the final perfection. Therefore, stifling of the individual may well be the stifling of the God in man. God in man. It is when the individual has the liberty to come in touch with their own divinity within. And it is through that the God in man can find its expression. Through that the group spirit find its divine expression. And in the present balance of humanity, there is seldom any real danger of exaggerated individualism breaking up the social integer. Social integer. Integer is a whole number. Society, if you look at society as a whole, unbroken whole, this wholeness of the group will not be broken by individualism, even if it is exaggerated. That danger is relatively not there compared to the other danger. What is the other danger? There is continually a danger that the exaggerated pressure of the social mass by its heavy, unenlightened mechanical weight may suppress or unduly discourage the free development of the individual spirit. So, compared to the two dangers, the danger of the collective mass consciousness imposing and suppressing the individual is more than the individual taking the liberty and through that exaggerated individualism breaking the collectivity. Between the two dangers, what is more in possibility is there is continually a danger that the exaggerated pressure of the social mass consciousness, by its heavy and unenlightened mechanical weight. This mass consciousness is something very heavy. While individuals can still be at a higher level of consciousness, mass consciousness tend to be very, very rudimentary, still pretty much animalistic, conservative. That mass consciousness, mechanical weight of it, may suppress or unduly discourage the free development of the individual spirit. That's the danger. Greater danger than individual disrupting and breaking the society. For man in the individual can be more easily enlightened, conscious, open to clear influences. Man in the mass is still obscure, half-conscious, ruled by universal forces that escape its mastery and its knowledge. So we individuals, when we are standing individually, there is a greater consciousness in us. This can be enlightened, made more conscious, and open to clear influences. Higher consciousness can happen. But the moment you identify with a group consciousness, man in the mass, the moment that identification happens, you become a group think. And that creature is more obscure, half-conscious, ruled by universal forces that escaped its mastery and its knowledge. So individual cannot really see the mass consciousness and how the mass consciousness drives him, his perceptions, thoughts, actions. Whereas when he detached from it and become an individual, there is a higher possibility of illuminating him, enlightening him, making him conscious and open to higher influences. Whereas the mass is heavy, half conscious, mechanical. Enlightening the mass is much more difficult than enlightening an individual. So this is the scenario that we need to really keep in mind and understand. The tension between the individualism and collectivism, where collectivism is in a position always to dominate the individual. An individual is not so much in a position to destroy the collectivity, because also individual is much more easier to be enlightened compared to the collectivity, which is mechanical, half-conscious. Against this danger of suppression and immobilization, nature in the individual reacts. So, on one hand, nature instinctively preferred the collectivity to control the individual. But that collectivity, being semi-conscious, mechanical and heavy, when it begins to suppress the individual, then the nature in the individual begins to revolt. So nature is playing from both the ends. She is at once the collectivity, she is also the individual. It's two hands of the same nature. When the collectivity imposes itself on the individual and suppress the individual, then the individual revolt and react. So against this danger of suppression and immobilization, nature in the individual reacts. Nature here is capital N. The larger universal nature in man reacts. It may react by an isolated resistance ranging from the instinctive and brutal revolt of the criminal to the complete negation of the solitary and ascetic. So the reaction of the individual against the collective suppression takes two turns. One is instinctive and brutal revolt of the criminal. We call someone a criminal when the person violates social norms, become violent. And the criminal is a revolt against the law and order. Criminal has established his own law. And that's brutal revolt. That's one way the individual revolts, by becoming the rebel who want to break the law. Is a revolt. But it is an isolated resistance. A criminal is an isolated individual who is revolting against the collective rules and regulations. He violates it. He revolts against it. The other is the complete negation of the solitary and ascetic. And we see it in India. Spiritual traditions told those who have a search for inner growth, reject the society, isolate yourself, and renounce everything. Negate the very social life and become independent, become solitary, become an ascetic. Once you're an ascetic, you can do whatever you want. You are outside the society. There is no danger to the society. You live whatever way you want, but you're an isolated individual. So it's a criminal who is an isolated individual. Both are two different forms of resistance against the collectivism, the pressure the collectivity puts on the individual. So it may react by an isolated resistance ranging from the instinctive and brutal revolt of the criminal to the complete negation of the solitary and ascetic. It may react by the assertion of the individualistic trend in social idea, may impose it on the mass consciousness and establish a compromise between the individual and social demand. So that is where the next level come into picture. There's a social idea. What is an ideal society? What idea governs the society as a reference point for its development? In that context, it will bring in the individualistic trend. That is, freedom of the individual is of supreme importance to the collectivism. Once that idea gets imposed into the mass consciousness, it can establish a compromise between individual and social demand. That is, it is legitimate to have individualism, individualistic freedom, individualistic pursuit of your own growth, journey, success, which is not something selfish. Individualism is sacred. So various philosophies, schools demand individual freedom is paramount. It must be given that legitimacy to compete, to succeed, all that. So the entire capitalist economy, for example, it empowers the individualism, individual freedom. But it does to such an extent, an individual can amass all wealth and drain the wealth of the society and accumulate everything to the individual, and it is still legitimized. But it will cause damage to the larger collectivity. And we see it already. Our ecological system damage is happening because of the individualism, freedom to consume, freedom to succeed, freedom to amass wealth for myself, compete in a free market. On the other side, we have communism that says, no, collectivism is more important, not the individual freedom. We are all equal. And centralized planning, production, that system attempted but failed because it suppressed individual liberty. So there is an assertion of the individualism and its liberty that creates a working compromise between individual and social demand. So it may react by assertion. First reaction is isolated resistance by the criminal or the ascetic or the solitary one. Second one is the stressing of the individualistic trend in the social idea. What is society? What should be the nature of the society? In which, what is the role of the freedom of the individual? Justifying the freedom of the individual, legitimizing the freedom of the individual, philosophically providing the support to the freedom of the individual. So an individualistic trend in the social idea may impose it on the mass consciousness and establish a compromise between the individual and social demand. But a compromise is not a solution. It only solves over the difficulty and in the end increases the complexity of the problem and multiplies its issues. So while stressing the individualism and individualistic tendency to create a compromise between the imposition of the collective on the individual may seem like a progress, but it makes things more complex, multiplies the issues. Once the individualism takes deep root in the individual, and you are feeling yourself to be entirely separate and entitled to be the individual, then bringing together such strong individuals to form a collectivity become increasingly difficult. In that process, individualism triumphs and the entire ecosystem, social welfare, everything begins to crumble. And we see it happening in the world. Our planetary health is at stake. But individualism-driven economic system that empowers individual freedom doesn't care. And how to solve it? This where it gets more complex, between how do we retain the individual liberty, at the same time collective harmony. It becomes 100 times more complex when the individuals become too egoistic, self-centered in their individualism. Compromise is not a solution. It only solves, but difficulty solves over the difficulty and in the end increases the complexity of the problem and multiplies its issues. Now we are sitting with that multiplied issue of, on one hand, individualism, on the other hand, collectivism trying to impose itself on the individual. And there is an increasing warfare between the two. That has reached a point where even the gender wars has deepened, separating the genders, conflict all the way down to every individual isolated, made lonely, depressed. That is where things are. A new principle has to be called in, other and higher than the two conflicting instincts, and powerful at once to override and reconcile them. So there is a need to bring in a new principle that can reconcile this conflict. So a new principle has to be called in, other and higher than the two conflicting instincts. These are instincts. Instinct of the individualism, instinct for the communalism or communalism. Both are subconscious instincts in the individual. Individual on one hand revolts, collectivity on the other hand imposes itself. Both are two master instincts in human nature. They are instincts, not conscious forces, instinctive forces. Other and higher than the two conflicting instincts, and powerful at once to override and reconcile them. So it must be, when we call in a new principle, it has to be higher than the instinct so that it can reconcile them. It is higher so that it can reconcile. Like this is antithesis being brought and synthesized by a higher perspective. Above the natural individual law, which sets up as one standard of conduct the satisfaction of our individual needs, preferences, and desires, and the natural communal law, which sets up as a superior standard the satisfaction of the needs, preferences, and desires of the community as a whole, there had to arise the notion of an ideal moral law, which is not the satisfaction of need and desire, but controls and even acquires or annuls them in the interests of the ideal order that is not animal, not vital or physical, but mental. A creation of the mind seeking for light and knowledge and right rule and right movement and true order. Here comes the mind with its philosophical understanding, which is no more driven by instinct, but it is self-aware, self-reflective. It can analyze, it can understand, and it can override the impulses of individualism. It can override the impulses of collectivism. These instinctive forces can be brought under control of a greater light of mind. And it can create an ideal moral law in the society. So this is a higher power than instinct-driven individualism, instinct-driven collectivism. So Sri Aurobindo, in the very beginning of this chapter, gave 4 different laws of conduct. First one is the individualism, individual needs, desires, preferences. Second one is the collectivism that imposes itself on the individual. Now the third one is the ideal, the moral, ethical, idealist, where the mind comes in. In the preceding 2 stages, it is the vital physical man, instinctive man, the animality in man that governs both individual and collectivity. Once the mind comes into picture, it is beginning to override the individualistic, impulsive, instinctive nature as well as collectivistic, impulsive, instinctive nature. It can bring in more enlightened, idealistic, moral law. So above the natural individual law, that is the instinctive individual law. What does it do? Which sets up as our one standard of conduct the satisfaction of our individual needs, preferences, and desires. That is what the natural law in man does, which is more instinctive way of satisfying our individual needs, preferences, and desires. On the other hand, we have the natural communal law. So we have one is natural individual law, the other is natural communal law. What does natural communal law does? which sets up as a superior standard the satisfaction of the needs, preferences, and desires of the community as a whole. So both natural laws are concerned with needs, preferences, and desires. One is concerned with individuals' needs, desires, and preferences. Other is concerned with collectivity's needs, desires, and preferences. Both are instinctive, both are unconscious, both are natural, like every other creature on nature, instinctive. But there had to arise the notion of an ideal moral law. Beyond them arises the ideal notion of moral law, which is not satisfaction of needs and desires. Here, moral law is looking at something that is beyond fulfillment of the needs and desire, but control and even coerce or annul them in the interest of an ideal order. Looking at what is the ideal order. In order to arrive at that ideal order, is this instinct and impulse to be controlled, annulled. That is not animal, not vital and physical, but mental. So that which brings this order is our mental range. That is not animal, not vital and physical, but mental. A creation of the mind seeking for light and knowledge and right rule and right movement and true order. So the mind is seeking the right understanding, true order. Mind is searching for knowledge. It is ignorant searching for knowledge, but yet it has that drive towards perfection, search for truth, search for light, even if it is ignorant, stumbling its way through. A creation of mind seeking for light and knowledge and right rule and right movement and true order. The moment this notion becomes powerful in man, he begins to escape from the engrossing vital and material into mental life. He climbs from the first to the second degree of threefold ascent of nature. A vital man lives in pure bodily instincts, impulses, the basic instincts of animal life, which is very much there in human nature. Mental life begins. That is where the moral, idealistic, ethical constructs come in and overrides the animal impulses, instincts. To the degree to which one is able to do, man is ascending from the first ladder to the second. This he is referring to the first two chapters, second and third chapter of Synthesis of Yoga, Introduction, the 3 steps of nature, threefold life, where Sri Aurobindo gives the first level is the vital man, vital physical man, instinctive animal life. Second is the mental life, where mentalized development happens, the mental culture that happens. Third is the spiritual man. So the spiritual, mental, and pure vital physical man, instinctive man. So we are moving from this vital physical man, the first step, to the mental man, when this idealism takes root in man and we are able to live from the mind and its ideals, its ethical understanding, its philosophy, its moral laws. Here mind is overriding the impulse, the instinct. So the moment this notion becomes powerful in man, he begins to escape from the engrossing vital and material into the mental life. Mental life. We are able to live in thoughts, ideals, dreams, visions. Idealism of man awakens. Instead of being engrossed in the vital and material life, hedonistic, sensual pleasure, indulgence, pure eating, mating, propagation, self-preservation instinct, enjoyment instinct. Beyond that, there is a pure world of mind, thoughts, ideas, ideals. He climbs from the first to the second degree of the threefold ascent of life, from the vital physical man to the mental man. Not yet the spiritual, but the mental, the second ladder, second step. His needs and desires themselves are touched with a more elevated light of purpose. So the animal needs and desires gets illumined by the light of purpose, the mind brings higher purpose into picture. Mind brings the rational intelligence and its light. And the mental need, the aesthetic, intellectual, and emotional desire begin to predominate over demand of the physical and vital nature. So the mental need. Mind requires its intellectual understanding, thirst for knowledge. It is also the one that develops the aesthetic sense when the refined part of the mind appreciates beauty, culture, all that is part of the growth. The intellectual man, the cultured man, the civilized man, aesthetically developed person, culturally refined person, all these are part of the second step into which we evolve and enter. And there is a refined emotional fulfillment that is beginning to predominate over the demand of the physical and vital nature. So that's how the idealist takes birth, who revolts against the social imposition, who revolts against the vital impulses and establishes the law and light of reason, and overrides, annuls the vital animal instincts, impulses, drives. So we see now the transition into the third type of law of conduct. First one was individualistic, animal driven. Second one was collectivistic but vital animal instinct of nature. The third is where the mental law, moral, ethical principle come into picture. So that law is now getting established here. That law is getting established that first two laws are operational in the first stage of human life, the animal vital stage. This is the second stage of human life where collectivity become more mentalized. And that is what currently is happening globally. We are a mentalized society, highly mentalized society. Though animal instincts are still there, but there is an attempt to control everything through rules, regulations, ethical, philosophical policies, principles. So he needs the desire themselves. His needs and desires themselves are touched with a more elevated light of purpose. And the mental need, the aesthetic, intellectual, and emotional desire begin to predominate over the demand of the physical and vital nature. So we go beyond purely instinctive animal nature to an intellectualized, mentalized, aestheticized, civilized, refined man. But it is still a mental culture. This is something we need to keep in mind. Now with that, we come to the end of this episode. Thank you for being with me in this journey. Please do share your observations, your experience of attempting to find your own freedom. And in that process, recognizing the instinctive, impulsive nature within you and how you get surrounded by the family, the work, customs of society, all that forcing you to conform to the rules and regulations, and yet something within you, starting with the rational intelligence that is saying, no, this is required. I can override my own impulses as well as the impulsive animal nature of the collectivity and establish the law of reason, principle-based self-regulation within your own individual life. Then how do we extend it to larger collectivity? So please do share your observations, your experiences, and that will help everyone else to learn together. Thank you. See you next week.